The difficult thing about racism today, it's not so much about what you can see, it's about what you can prove. A lot of times when we talk about racism, we overlook the fact that we made this hard shift from a period of explicit racism during the Jim Crow era to this period of time where even though the laws changed, the people and some of their attitudes didn't change. So therefore, going from a period of time where racism was more blatant and more expressive to a period of where you had to now kind of figure out if this was racism or not happened literally overnight. Let's take a moment to see if we can make some sense of how racism operates in a world where people sometimes present as if it doesn't exist. Oftentimes when we think about racism from the historical standpoint, we typically defer back to the period of what we call Jim Crow. The reason why that period is so profound was not only was the culture and the attitudes about racism so explicit and expressed towards people of color, we also overlook the fact that a lot of the laws expressly encapsulated these as well. Whether it be restrictive covenants, which basically restricted homeowners from selling their homes to people of color, or redlining, where you were effectively cording off specific areas and populations as being undesirable for purposes of home ownership and home building, to even the Jim Crow laws themselves, which basically prohibit individuals from going into certain spaces and isolated schools and workplaces in a discriminatory manner. During this time period, people not only understood where the lines of demarcation were, in other words, what was and what was not acceptable, but this was also encapsulating racism within the institutions. Therefore, not only was the culture at the time that of expressed racism towards people of color, it was integrated and immersed within the institutions as well. Therefore, there was no confusion about what was and what was not considered racist or discriminatory at the time. The 1970s ushered in a brand new shift in terms of the actual line in the sand from the laws that were on the books. We now have the Civil Rights Act, the Voters' Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, as well as Brown versus Board of Education. So you've now got this period of time where you've had all of these tumultuous periods where we've literally worked hard to change the laws. The problem is that even though the laws may have changed, the attitudes at the time didn't. Unfortunately, what happened was, even though the laws were created in such a way to create greater opportunities and to address all the institutional racism and discrimination and bigotry that was going on at the time, it was not the same effort to change the hearts and minds of the people. So now what happened is that you've now gone into this new world where even though the institutions have adapted to eliminate, reduce, or cut down on those laws that had discriminatory or bigotry intent, you still had those same people who previously had those feelings now moving into this new period of time where they're having to learn how to maneuver, where their discriminatory and bigotry and the intent that they had before, which was expressly permitted in a prior time period, is now no longer permitted. But one of the problems that came from this is that we now started presenting with this new narrative where people were effectively saying, now that we've addressed the problem, you don't have anything to worry about. But the problem is the people who are on the receiving end did have something to worry about. So then what happened is that we started moving into the situation of what I would call situational racism. This is where individuals now they were now no longer facing the institutional type of racism that they were experiencing, but they now had these various situations that presented themselves where they were constantly trying to navigate whether what they were dealing with was actually racism in itself or was it something else. Whether it be situations like being pulled over because you fit the profile of someone, whether because you were not getting the same measure of treatment in various establishments that some of your lighter-skinned colleagues received, whether you walked into a space and found the people were not as engaging. So now what was happening is that people of color, Black people specifically, were now moving into this space where they now had to figure out on their own whether the situations they were dealing with was reflective of a discriminatory or bigoted intent, or whether it was something else. The other problem that we often found that was presenting itself under this new world order is that you found people who were going out of their way, bending over backwards to try to rationalize why this unequal treatment was being justified. In other words, when you as a person of color or a Black person is literally saying yourself based on what you're seeing, you're experiencing, and what you're communicating with your friends that this is racism, and you have people who don't look like you, who are literally trying to convince you that this is something other than that. And what you're doing now is you're putting the onus upon people of color to have to now bear the burden of having to distinguish between what is and what's not. And it becomes even more troubling when individuals who have maybe never experienced this are effectively trying to tell you that what you are experiencing, you're not experiencing. So as such, even though we are roughly 50 plus years removed from 1970, which is 55 years or more removed, you now have this situation where you still have to remind people that at the time when the laws changed, and we applaud the laws that were put into place that were designed as a tool to allow Black people and people of color to be able to protect themselves, protect their voting rights, protect their housing rights, protect their civil rights. We have to also remember that there were people in those same time periods who still live here today who were adamantly against those things and dedicated themselves for the next 50 plus years to take whatever action that was available to them to be able to either undermine, undo, or provide for a new world order that would allow them to go back to the way things previously were. So the question I ask you is this: what do you do when the law says this, but people act a completely different way? Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we've made a lot of great strides as a country, and we know that there's a lot more that we need to do to go forward. But it's important to remember that there are still people here who literally are adamantly and passionately against the changes that have been made that have been designed to redress and address all of the problematic areas that were presented to us over this period of time. In other words, we got to keep in mind that when we're going forward, that as we are going through these growing pains, there are still an adamant section of this society who have aggressively worked and aggressively fought towards trying to reestablish the world order that was present before the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and Fair Housing Act. And even more so, it's important for you to understand that when you're dealing with Black people or other people of color who are engaging these people or engaging these scenarios, to not be so quick to tell them that what they're seeing is not what they're actually seeing. Because at the end of the day, it may actually be racism. It may actually be bigotry. It may actually be discrimination. So instead of telling the person that what they're seeing, they're not seeing, or what they're experiencing, they're not experiencing, let's focus on what we can do to make sure we address that concern and go forward to change hearts and minds of those people who want to push us back and keep us from going forward in the way that we've been trying to do so far.